The prince in a gilded cage, the palace orb of Velarion, hung in the void like a pearl adrift in a black ocean, its spires glimmering with light that never dimmed, never faltered. To mortal eyes, it would seem a dream of eternity made solid, an entire world carved of crystal and star metal, wrapped in atmospheres of rose gold. Within its walls lived the most powerful dynasty the galaxy had ever known. Within those walls also lived Prince Aelion, heir apparent, first son of the Emperor, and he was suffocating. From his earliest breath, Aelion had been swaddled in perfection. His tutors filled him with knowledge so vast that human scholars would need 100 lifetimes to learn what he was given before he reached maturity. His chambers overflowed with treasures stolen from conquered worlds, jeweled masks from the flame world of Rast, singing statues from the oceans of Araya, even a forest sealed beneath a crystal dome where birds with wings of fire sang endlessly for his delight. Yet the forest smelled of nothing. The birds never died, never changed their tune. Their beauty was eternal, but to Aelion it was a prison, another loop in an endless pattern that stretched forward without end. Velarions were not mortal in the way humans were. Their lifespans measured in centuries, their flesh renewed by sciences older than most civilizations. Pain was rare, disease non-existent. Even death itself, that final sculptor of human life, was postponed until it became a choice. But to Aelion that gift was a curse. What worth was life if it could not be lost? What meaning had laughter if it was never sharpened by the shadow of grief? He would stand at the highest balconies of the orb, gazing into the eternal night, and feel the emptiness press upon him like invisible chains. On the day of his ascension rites announcement, the court gathered in shimmering halls that curved like the inside of a star. Nobles glided in robes that trailed light. Courtiers moved with choreographed grace. At the center, the Emperor, Aelion's father, sat upon a throne that was not truly a seat but a living fusion of metal and mind, binding him to the will of the Empire itself. His voice was iron wrapped in silk as he spoke. My son Aelion of the House of Velarion shall soon ascend as heir and steward of eternity. He shall inherit not merely a throne but the legacy of 1,000 worlds, the blood of kings, the unbroken chain of immortality. The crowd bowed. Aelion bowed as well. But inside a storm raged. He could not confess it, not to his father, not to his council, not even to the servants who adored him. Yet when the word eternity echoed through the chamber, it struck him not with pride but with dread. Eternity meant more of the same endless silken corridors, more ritual, more perfection polished until it gleamed lifeless. And then, as if fate wished to taunt him, came whispers of the humans. It was during his secret hours, when he roamed the palace's private archives, that he found them, records of a small, fragile species huddled on the outer spiral arms of the galaxy. Unlike the Velarions, their lives burned like sparks, flickering, brief but dazzling with color. He devoured stories of their wars, their love songs, their explorers who set sail into the void with ships built of scrap and fire. But what seized him most was the tale of a man, Captain Elias Reeve. The archives told of him as if reluctantly, as though the Velarion scribes found it shameful to record the victories of one so mortal. Born on a broken earth, raised amid ruins, Reeve had risen from nothing. No throne, no inheritance, no genetic perfection, only his grit, his cunning, and his will. He had carved a place among the stars, commanding a vessel known as the Wayfarer, a ship patched 100 times over, but alive in a way no palace orb could ever be. Aelion lingered on every detail, the crew who followed Reeve not because of bloodline, but because he earned their loyalty. The scars that lined his face etched by battles he had survived by inches, the way he laughed, loudly, unashamed, knowing that death waited for him just beyond the next horizon. To Aelion, Elias Reeve embodied something the Velarions had lost long ago: humanity, fragility, freedom. That night, unable to sleep in his bed of silken fibers that adjusted to his every breath, Aelion slipped through hidden corridors until he reached the viewport above the palace gardens. The stars glittered like scattered embers. He pressed his palm to the glass, and for the first time he whispered words he had never dared speak aloud. I envy them. The admission startled him. It felt like treason to the blood that flowed in his veins. Yet it was true. He envied the humans, their pain, their struggle, their mortality. He envied Elias Reeve, who had become something instead of being born everything. The days that followed stretched like glass across fire. Every ceremony, every lecture, every bow and curtsy felt hollow. His tutors spoke of strategy and politics, but their words slid from his mind like water over stone. He was haunted instead by visions of human lives, children laughing though they starved, lovers clutching each other in the face of war, explorers weeping as they discovered worlds that would outlive them. He could not tell his father. The emperor would dismiss it as childish fancy or worse, rebellion. He could not tell his courtiers, for their faces wore masks of devotion to duty, and none would dare question the sanctity of Velarion eternity, so he bore it alone, his envy festering, a seed that would soon crack the foundations of his gilded cage. One evening, after the ritual of endless petitions where nobles pleaded for imperial favor, Aelion wandered into the gardens beneath the crystal dome. The birds sang their eternal songs. The trees stood frozen in their perpetual bloom. He thought of human forests, of leaves that withered and fell, of branches broken by storms, of growth through death and decay. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine what it would be like to walk in such a forest. To feel mud beneath his feet, to hear silence after the birds had flown, to know that tomorrow the world might change. He could not. When he opened his eyes, the garden was the same as it had always been, as it always would be, Aelion whispered, almost to himself. If this is eternity, then eternity is a tomb. Above him, the stars stretched vast and unknowable. Somewhere among them, a mortal man named Elias Reeve was sailing, scarred hands gripping the helm of a ship stitched together by hope and will. Somewhere among them, humanity was burning through its brief, brilliant years, living with a passion that Velarion eternity could never know. And deep in his heart, Prince Aelion felt the first flicker of rebellion, a longing not just to see humans but to be one, to exchange the certainty of a throne for the risk of freedom, to abandon immortality for the chance to truly live. It was madness. It was impossible. It was treason, but it was also inevitable. For in that moment, as the eternal birds sang their unchanging song, the alien prince realized that he would rather die a human than live forever as a Velarion. And so the story began. The captain of ash and fire far from the palace orb of Velarion, where eternity gleamed like a polished jewel, there drifted a ship that had no business still being alive. The wayfarer was ugly by imperial standards, a patchwork of old alloys and scavenged hull plates, its engines coughing fire with every ignition. Its corridors were narrow, its cabins cold, its air filters often sour with age. Yet for the men and women who lived within it, the wayfarer was more than steel. It was a home, a companion, a beast that roared through the void at their side. At its helm stood Captain Elias Reeve, a man forged in fire and ash. Elias had been born on Earth, not the lush, dreaming Earth of legend, but the broken husk left behind after centuries of climate collapse and orbital wars. The oceans had risen, swallowing cities. Nations had splintered into warlords and scavenger tribes. He had no family name, no inheritance, no promise beyond hunger. His first memory was of fire. The sky above his settlement had burned red as orbital weapons rained down. He had been a child, no older than 6, when his mother pressed a shard of metal into his hand and said, "Survive." By dawn, she was gone. Survive he did. He scavenged among ruins, stole from soldiers, clawed his way through the ashes of a dying world. At 15, he stowed away on a freighter bound for the colonies. At 16, he was a deckhand on a smuggler's craft, scrubbing engines with bleeding hands. By 20, he had fought in 3 mercenary skirmishes, earned scars across his jaw and brow, and killed his first man. By 30, he had a ship. Not a gift, not an inheritance. He had won the Wayfarer in a gamble so reckless that men still told the tale in cantinas across half the spiral. He had walked into that game with nothing but a stolen sidearm and a face full of audacity. He had walked out a captain, and he had never stopped fighting to keep the ship alive. Elias Reeve was not a handsome man. His face was too hard, his nose bent from an old break, his mouth set in a line that rarely softened. But his eyes, gray as storm-swept steel, burned with something the Velarions had long forgotten. Hunger. Not the hunger of food, though he had known that too, but hunger for more, for freedom, for tomorrow, for life, even if tomorrow never came. His crew followed him not because of bloodline or destiny, but because he had earned every ounce of their loyalty. He bled with them when raids went wrong. He laughed with them when fortunes turned. He buried them when luck ran out. He carried their ghosts in the lines of his face and the weight of his silence. The Wayfarer was no palace, but it was alive. Its engine thrum was a heartbeat. Its patched hull bore the scars of battle survived by inches. Its decks were stained with oil, blood, and laughter. Where the Velarions lived in crystalline perfection, the crew of the Wayfarer lived in sweat, risk, and the fragile brilliance of being mortal. Elias had earned another title among traders and smugglers, the Ash Captain. It was not a name he had chosen. It was given after the raid at Novar's Rift, when the Wayfarer limped away from a blockade with half its hull on fire. Elias had refused to surrender. He had refused to abandon his crew, even as flames devoured the decks. He had fought through smoke and metal, dragging survivors one by one to the escape pods, before returning to the helm himself. When the Wayfarer emerged from the rift, blackened and burning, men whispered that the captain had walked out of the ashes unbroken. From then on, he was the Ash Captain, the man who would not die. To the Velarions, men like Elias were curiosities. Fleeting sparks, brief flames, unworthy of imperial notice except when they disrupted trade routes. But to Prince Aelion, sitting in his palace orb of eternity, Elias Reeve was a living embodiment of everything his soul craved. Aelion studied every scrap of archive he could find. He memorized the shape of Elias's scar across his jaw, the records of his battles, the maps of his journeys. He read transcripts of human songs that crewmen had sung aboard the Wayfarer, songs that rose from the gut instead of being written by immortal composers. And in the quiet hours of the night, Aelion imagined himself standing upon that battered deck, wind from a broken air recycler in his face, the hum of mortal engines shaking beneath his feet. He imagined himself as one of them, laughing, bleeding, living. Elias himself did not know that far away in a palace of crystal and gold. A prince envied him. He knew only the life of the stars, the weight of command, the endless risk that each jump might be his last. He never thought of himself as legend. He thought only of the next trade, the next raid, the next meal. He drank with his crew, fought beside them, and cursed the void that swallowed too many of their names. Yet even as he cursed, he loved it. Loved the fight. Loved the fleeting brilliance of days that could vanish tomorrow. To him, immortality was not a gift. It was a lie. A man was meant to burn, not to linger. One night, while the Wayfarer drifted beyond the reach of any law, Elias stood alone at the viewport, a bottle in his hand. Stars stretched before him like cold embers scattered across the dark. He traced them with his eyes, thinking of the men and women buried among them. His mother, his comrades, his friends. He drank deeply, then spoke aloud into the silence. Another day stolen. "Old girl," he said, patting the glass as though it were the ship itself. "Another day we shouldn't have had. But we'll take it. We'll take every damn one until the void gets us." The ship groaned as if in answer, its patched hull trembling with life. Elias smiled, weary but fierce. He was no prince, no emperor, no immortal. He was a man of ash and fire, and he would rather burn for a day than live forever in a cage of gold. Unseen across the void, a different man, young, perfect, eternal, whispered the same truth in his heart. And though they did not yet know it, the lives of the alien prince and the human captain were already moving toward collision. One envied the fire he could never possess. The other carried that fire without ever knowing how rare it was. Soon their paths would cross, and when they did, the galaxy itself would tremble. The forbidden encounter. The first time Prince Aelion saw Captain Elias Reeve in the flesh, he almost forgot to breathe. It was not in some battlefield clash or starlit adventure, but in the polished, suffocating grandeur of a diplomatic summit. The Velarions, ever aloof from the mortal races, had summoned human envoys to the palace orb for a trade accord. To the Empire, it was a trivial arrangement, permits and tariffs, the legal fencing of one more lesser species. But to Aelion it was a chance. He had prepared for weeks in secret, devouring every scrap of intelligence on Reeve's movements. The captain's name appeared in half-rumors, whispered at the edges of smuggling routes and colonial stations. But now, improbably, impossibly, the Ash Captain himself had been contracted to escort a human delegation through dangerous space to the gates of Velarion majesty. Aelion felt it like destiny. The hall of reception glowed with a cold, sterile brilliance. Columns of crystal rose into infinity, reflecting the pale light of hovering orbs. Velarion courtiers stood like statues, their faces perfected by centuries of refinement. They moved in silence, their every gesture choreographed to display poise, restraint, eternity. Then the humans entered. They were ragged by comparison, their uniforms patched, their boots scuffed by dust from countless docks. They walked with a looseness that seemed almost vulgar to Velarion eyes, laughing softly among themselves, whispering, shifting, alive in ways that immortals had long ago polished away. And there, at the head of their group, strode Elias Reeve. He was not what the prince's imagination had painted. He was smaller, scarred, his posture stiff from old injuries. His uniform was nothing but worn leather and fabric cut for utility, not ceremony. Yet his presence struck Aelion harder than any sculpted noble's beauty ever had. The captain's face bore the map of his life, creases at the brow, a crooked nose, a line of scar along his jaw. His eyes were restless storms of steel. He moved like a man accustomed to danger at every corner, a wolf among lambs. Where Velarions floated with elegance, Reeve walked as though each step might be his last and each one mattered. Aelion, swathed in silks, jeweled crest shimmering on his brow, suddenly felt naked. The summit unfolded in formalities. The emperor presided, his voice thunderous with the authority of ages. Trade agreements were recited, gestures exchanged, ritual after ritual performed. To most, it was another performance in the endless theater of empire. But to Aelion, every moment was sharpened by the weight of the man standing among mortals. He watched how Reeve leaned against a column instead of standing stiff. He noticed how the crew behind him deferred not to blood but to the tilt of his head. And when the captain caught his eye for the briefest instant, Aelion felt himself stripped bare. It was not recognition. Reeve did not know him. To Reeve, he was only another prince, another ornament in the palace's endless gallery. But that glance, unimpressed, unafraid, was like a blade across Aelion's pride. All his life, men and women bowed when he entered a room. Yet here was a human who looked at him as though he were merely another man. For the first time, Aelion knew envy as something physical, a burning under his skin. That night, when the halls quieted and the court drifted away, Aelion could not sleep. The meeting had infected him. He wanted more than a glance. He wanted words. He wanted to test himself against the mortal flame, and so, with the recklessness that only the suffocated can know, he disguised himself, shedding jewels and silks. He wrapped himself in plain cloth, darkened his hair with oils, and slipped through service corridors long forgotten by the nobility. The palace orb was vast, but he had walked its bones since childhood. He knew the hidden ways, the shadowed vents, the passages meant for servants' feet. He followed whispers of the humans to the docking ring, where their freighter rested under Velarion guard. There, in the shadow of his empire's majesty, Aelion saw the wayfarer for the first time. She was smaller than he imagined, battered, ugly, and beautiful. Plates of mismatched metal overlapped across her hull like scars. The engines bore scorch marks from countless escapes. Antennas jutted at odd angles patched with human ingenuity. She looked fragile beside the towering Velarion escorts, but Aelion's heart ached at the sight. This was no palace built to last an eternity. This was a creature born to survive, to fight for every second. And beside her ramp, smoking a thin roll of something bitter, stood Captain Elias Reeve. Alone. Aelion's pulse hammered. He stepped forward. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was rough, jagged. Reeve didn't even turn his head. He had heard the prince's steps before he spoke. Aelion hesitated, startled by the bluntness. He had been trained to speak in layers of politeness, to mask intent behind silk. But here was a man who cut through ceremony like a blade. "I wish to see your ship," Aelion said, keeping his voice low. "The stories of the wayfarer reach even our halls." At that, Reeve turned. His eyes narrowed, scanning the disguised figure before him. He saw at once the hands too soft for work, the bearing too straight for servitude. But he said nothing of it. Instead, he exhaled smoke and gave a humorless chuckle. "She's no palace, if that's what you're expecting. She creaks, she leaks, she bleeds. But she's ours. Every inch earned." The words hit Aelion like an arrow. Earned. How foreign that was to him. How intoxicating. "I envy you," Aelion blurted before he could stop himself. Reeve raised an eyebrow. "Envy a man who sleeps in a steel box and eats recycled protein?" "Yes," Aelion whispered. "Because you live." For a moment, silence stretched between them. The vast gulf of two worlds hung in the air, one eternal, gilded, and suffocating. The other fragile, scarred, and free. Reeve studied him, then shook his head with a wry half-smile. "Careful what you wish for, stranger. This life costs more than you can imagine. You think it's freedom? It's hunger. It's cold. It's burying the people you'd die for." Aelion's chest tightened. To Reeve, these were curses. To Aelion, they sounded like treasures. "I would give anything," he said, "for even a taste." The captain stubbed his smoke against the ramp, eyes narrowing once more. "Anything?" he asked, voice like gravel. But before Aelion could answer, footsteps echoed. Guards. The prince vanished into shadow, retreating the way he came. Reeve stood alone, staring after the strange figure, uneasy. He had seen many men burn with longing for what they didn't understand. Most were consumed by it, but this one felt different. When Aelion returned to his chamber, heart pounding, he could still taste the smoke in the air, still hear the rough music of a human voice that spoke without bowing. His silken bed felt colder than ever. He knew then that the hunger inside him would never fade. He had crossed the line between envy and desire once awakened could not be contained. Sparks of rebellion. The forbidden meeting with Captain Elias Reeve lingered in Prince Aelion's mind like a fire that refused to die. Days passed, yet he could not banish the sound of that gravel-edged voice, nor the way the captain had spoken to him without bowing, without reverence, without fear. "You live," Aelion had whispered that night, and even now the words echoed like a confession. The palace orb went on as it always did. Endless ceremonies, endless lessons, endless rituals. Nobles drifted like painted phantoms through glittering corridors, their faces unchanged for centuries, their laughter rehearsed. Aelion moved among them like a ghost himself, smiling when expected, bowing when required. But inside he was burning. Every sight reminded him of what he lacked. The eternal gardens with their unchanging birds seemed lifeless now. The palace chambers, untouched by time, felt like tombs. Even the stars beyond the windows mocked him, glittering with promise he could never reach, and so the prince began to rebel. Not in open defiance, he was no fool, but in secret steps, each one carrying him further from the life prepared for him. It began with disguises. Aelion stole garments meant for servants, cloaking his royal bearing beneath rough fabric. He smeared soot across his pale skin, bound his jeweled crest in cloth. Then, through the hidden arteries of the palace orb, he slipped past guards and into the outer docks where ships from the lesser races came and went. There, for the first time he set foot on human soil, or rather, human steel. The outposts that clung to Velarion space were crude, half-floating cities of rust and neon. They stank of fuel and sweat, their air thick with voices speaking a dozen tongues. The Velarions who oversaw them rarely mingled with mortals. To them, these stations were waypoints, little more than tools for commerce. But to Aelion they were revelations. He walked among humans who laughed too loudly, argued fiercely, embraced without hesitation. He saw a child tumble in the dirt, scrape her knee, and wail in pain. The mother gathered her up, kissing the wound, whispering comfort. Aelion stood frozen, struck by the simple miracle of it, pain, comfort, love, all bound in a single fleeting moment. In Velarion courts, children were raised by gene nurses and tutors, emotion suppressed until it dulled into composure. He had never seen a mother's tears fall for her child's cut skin. He had never seen pain treated as something precious, a mark of being alive. That night he could not sleep. He replayed the child's cry again and again, feeling envy like hunger in his chest. His secret journeys became more daring. He wandered through bazaars where traders shouted over each other, bartering scraps of metal, dried fruits, and contraband weapons. He listened to human songs in smoky cantinas, raw voices cracking on high notes, untrained, imperfect, but carrying more fire than 1,000 symphonies. He sat among miners who told crude jokes and slapped his back as if he were one of them, not knowing the truth. Each encounter chipped away at the shell of eternity. Each taste of humanity left him hungrier. He learned that humans fought over scraps yet shared their last meal with strangers. He saw lovers arguing fiercely in the streets, only to kiss with equal ferocity moments later. He watched men risk their lives in games of chance, then laugh when fortune ruined them. To Velarions, such chaos would be disgrace. To Aelion, it was freedom. And always, in the back of his mind, lingered the image of Elias Reeve, the man who embodied it all. One evening, in a crowded tavern near the docks, Aelion listened as a scarred pilot recounted a tale of the wayfarer. They were cornered. "I cornered at Varos Gate," the pilot said, slamming his cup for emphasis. "Imperial patrol on one side, pirate clan on the other. Anyone else would have folded, but not Reeve." "No, the Ash Captain," he laughed. He cut engines, drifted dead in the void, let the pirates close in. Then bam! Lit the drives and sent his ship roaring straight through their formation. Left the Imperials dumbfounded, left the pirates in pieces. "The man's a devil." The room erupted in laughter and cheers. Aelion's heart thundered. He could see it in his mind's eye. Reeve at the helm, eyes burning, hands steady, risking everything, not for destiny, but because he chose to. When Aelion returned to the palace orb, the silence was unbearable. The halls gleamed like ice, empty of warmth. The nobles whispered of trade tariffs and genetic councils, their voices drained of life. Aelion wanted to scream. He realized then that he could never return fully. His heart now belonged to the dirt-strewn streets, the laughter of mortals, the fire of men like Reeve. But rebellion does not stay hidden forever. The Emperor, who was bound to the mind of the Empire itself, began to notice his son's absences. Advisors whispered of odd behavior. The prince distracted, his eyes restless, his presence unreliable. When pressed, Aelion offered excuses, meditation, study, exhaustion. But doubt grew in the Emperor's gaze. One evening, after the recitation of court decrees, the Emperor called him aside. "My son," he said, voice heavy with centuries, "you walk with shadows upon you. Speak." Aelion bowed, concealing the tremor in his chest. "I am weary, father. That is all." But the Emperor's eyes pierced him. "You have looked upon the mortals too long. Do not mistake their sparks for stars. They burn bright, yes, but only because they are weak. We are not meant to envy them. We are meant to rule them." The words struck like cold iron. Aelion bowed again, silent. But inside, rebellion flared hotter. That night he returned once more to the viewport, staring into the abyss. He thought of Reeve's words outside the Wayfarer. "Careful what you wish for. This life costs more than you can imagine." He thought of the child's cry, the mother's kiss, the tavern's laughter, the pilot's story. Yes, there was cost, pain, hunger, death. But what was eternity without them? A cage of gold. A song that never changed. Aelion clenched his fists. He no longer wanted merely to observe. He no longer wanted to slip into shadows and taste scraps of humanity. He wanted to live it fully, to bleed, to hunger, to laugh with a mouthful of blood and still rise to fight again. He wanted what Reeve had, and he was willing to risk everything. Crown, bloodline, eternity, to claim it. From that moment, the prince's fate was sealed. He was no longer just an heir. He was a rebel in spirit, a traitor in waiting, a man with envy sharp enough to cut the chains of a dynasty. The sparks had been struck, and soon they would ignite into fire. The crown's weight. The palace orb was vast, but Aelion felt its walls pressing closer with each passing day. The more he longed for the fire of mortal lives, the colder the air of eternity seemed. His father, the Emperor, had not spoken further of suspicion. Yet Aelion felt the shadow of his gaze on every step. Court life continued. Banquets of starlight fruit, processions under crystalline domes, the endless empty songs of immortality. To the nobles, these were the pillars of order. To Aelion, they were shackles. But it was not only boredom that suffocated him now. It was the crown. One dawn, he was summoned to the throne spire. The chamber was carved from a single shard of obsidian, walls alive with shifting constellations drawn from the Empire's living map. At its center sat the Emperor, not merely a ruler but a vessel of the eternal mind, the ancestral consciousness of Velarion monarchs stretching back eons. Aelion approached, cloaked in ceremonial white. His heart thudded as the Emperor's voice filled the chamber. "My son, the time approaches when you must take the oath of continuance. The crown weighs heavily and it is time you feel its burden." Aelion's breath faltered. The oath was no mere formality. It was the binding, an intertwining of mind and empire, a merging with the chorus of past rulers. To swear it was to surrender part of one's soul to eternity. It was the final step toward becoming emperor. He bowed. As you will, father. But inside, terror clawed at him. If he took the oath, he would never escape. His envy of humanity would be crushed beneath voices of ancestors who had long ago buried desire. He would cease to be Aelion. He would become the throne itself. The Emperor studied him, ancient eyes unreadable. Do not fear the weight. Fear only weakness. Eternity spares no place for longing. Longing. The word felt like a blade. Did his father know? Did the eternal mind already sense the cracks in him? Aelion left the chamber with his chest burning, the echo of eternity gnawing at his ears. The pressure grew. Nobles began offering veiled congratulations. Advisors pressed plans for his reign. Even the air seemed thick with expectation, as if the palace itself leaned toward his inevitable coronation. But Aelion's nights belonged elsewhere. He stole away in disguise again, slipping into the docking bays, breathing in the crude air of human stations. The filth, the noise, the chaos, it was balm. On one such night he found himself seated in a low tavern, surrounded by miners whose hands were scarred from work. They drank, laughed, argued over cards. One man slapped him on the back, spilling drink on his stolen tunic. Aelion laughed with them, the sound raw and real in his throat. The miners spoke of homeworlds scorched by war, of debts they could never repay, of lovers waiting in ports light years away. Their stories were heavy, soaked in pain, and yet they laughed between them, binding their wounds with shared struggle. Aelion envied them more than ever. They had nothing, and in that nothing, they had everything. Back in the palace, another summons awaited, this time from the High Oracle. The Oracle's chamber was woven from strands of living crystal, glowing faintly with unseen currents. She was no ordinary seer, but a voice chosen by the eternal mind itself. When Aelion entered, her eyes already fixed on him, pale and knowing. "You are restless, Prince," she said, her voice a whisper that filled the room. "You hunger for something beyond the veil of your birth?" Aelion's pulse quickened. "You see much." "I see a shadow trailing you," the Oracle continued. "A choice approaching. One path binds you to eternity. The other leads to fire and ash." Her words chilled him. He knew which path was which. Eternity was the oath. Fire and ash, that was humanity. The Oracle leaned closer, her voice sharp now. "Beware envy. It has slain more kings than swords." Aelion bowed, hiding the storm in his chest. But envy was not merely a poison. It was a calling. The breaking point came days later. Aelion was forced to attend a ceremony honoring the conquest of a distant human colony. The court feasted while holograms displayed the burning of mortal cities. Nobles clapped as ships fell in flames, as mortals wept before Velarion legions. To them it was glory. To Aelion it was desecration. When the hologram showed a child reaching for her fallen father, Aelion's chest twisted. He saw again that small scrape in the dirt, the mother's kiss, the fragile beauty of fleeting pain. And here, his people mocked it as weakness. He excused himself from the banquet, hands trembling, bile in his throat. In the shadows of the palace garden, he whispered aloud to the stars, "I will not become this. I cannot." And for the first time, the thought of outright rebellion burned clear in him. Not just envy, not just longing, but defiance. That night, he dreamed of Captain Reeve. The dream was vivid, almost prophetic. Reeve at the helm of the Wayfarer, his face lit by dying suns, his ship scarred yet still flying. He turned, his gaze piercing Aelion, and spoke only one line. "A crown is only heavy if you keep wearing it." Aelion woke in a sweat, the words echoing. Yes, the crown was heavy, but what if he cast it aside? From then on, he prepared in silence. He studied maps of trade routes and patrol schedules, memorizing how to slip past the Empire's grip. He scavenged bits of mortal currency in the markets, hiding them beneath his chambers. He even began training his body in secret, pushing himself to exhaustion, seeking the raw edge of pain that humans knew daily. Yet each step he took was shadowed by danger. He could feel the Emperor's awareness tightening, the eternal mind brushing against his thoughts like a predator circling prey. Soon, he would be discovered. Soon, he would have to choose. And so the weight grew unbearable. The crown loomed closer, the oath waiting, eternity calling him into its cold embrace. But Aelion had already chosen fire. The envy that once gnawed quietly now blazed in his chest. He would not be a vessel of eternity. He would not be the next emperor, chained forever to a lifeless throne. He would claim a ship. He would live as men lived, even if it cost him everything. The choice of fire, the palace orb, was a prison of glass. Aelion could feel it now more than ever. Walls gleaming with perfection, floors that echoed his footsteps like a reminder of his cage. The corridors seemed narrower, the ceilings lower, though he knew nothing had changed. It was his own heart swelling too wide for eternity. The summons came sooner than he had feared. At dawn, the Emperor declared the oath of continuance would take place within a cycle. The court erupted in celebration, music, banners, processions of eternal splendor. Nobles bowed to Aelion with new weight in their gestures. They saw him as already bound, already theirs, already absorbed into the chorus of forever. But Aelion was not theirs. Not anymore, he smiled, bowed, played the dutiful air. But inside, his decision had already been made. That night he returned to the viewport garden where he had first met Captain Elias Reeve. He pressed his palm against the cold glass, staring into the abyss. Stars pulsed like distant heartbeats, and Aelion whispered to them as though they were listening gods. "I will not kneel," he said softly, "not to eternity, not to a throne. I choose fire." The words shook him because they were not metaphor. They were vow, and vows, once spoken into the abyss, had a way of shaping destiny. The days that followed were preparation. Aelion cloaked himself in servant garb and vanished into the underdocks, where the Empire's presence was weaker. He traded heirlooms of his house, small jewels, a crest pin, even fragments of crystalline fabric for human credits and forged papers. The merchants laughed at his poor bargaining, but they took the trinkets without question. To them he was just another desperate soul. He stole a weapon crude by Velarion standards but alive with weight and danger. A human plasma pistol. He held it in his palm, marveling at how fragile yet final it felt. One pull of the trigger, one mistake, and a life could end. Velarions rarely handled such things. They thought them vulgar. To Aelion, it was proof of mortality, of consequence. Every step into human filth drew him deeper into hunger. He longed for the wayfarer. He longed to stand at Reeve's side, not as a prince, but as a man who bled and fought and chose his own fate. But fate does not wait quietly. On the eve of his planned escape, the Emperor summoned him again. The throne spire was darker than before, shadows clinging to its obsidian walls. The Emperor sat unmoving, but the eternal mind seemed to hum louder in the chamber, like the whisper of 1,000 voices pressing against Aelion's skull. "My son," the Emperor said, his tone heavy with ages, "you have walked paths unfit for an heir. The whispers reach me. You sully your blood among mortals, listening to their chaos, breathing their weakness." Aelion stiffened, fighting to mask the tremor in his hands. "I have only sought to understand what we rule." The Emperor's gaze cut through him. "You seek more than understanding. You seek to become. Do not lie to me, child. The eternal mind hears what you try to hide." The voices pressed harder. Aelion felt his thoughts fray at the edges, as if invisible claws scraped at his very will. His breath came shallow. The eternal mind was vast, endless, impossible to resist, but then he remembered the tavern laughter, the child's cry, Reeve's fire-forged eyes, and he pushed back. "I do not want eternity," Aelion whispered. "I want life." The words were treason. They thundered in the chamber like blasphemy. The Emperor's face did not change, but the air thickened until Aelion could barely breathe. "You speak as a fool. Life is fleeting. Fire burns out. We are beyond such weakness. You will take the oath, and you will silence this envy." "No," Aelion said, voice shaking but unbroken. "I will not." The Emperor rose slowly. His shadow fell across the chamber, vast and suffocating. "Then you are no son of mine. You are a traitor to your blood." The eternal mind surged forward, flooding the room with its chorus of ancient voices. They pressed into Aelion's mind a tidal wave of command. Bow, submit, obey. For one terrible moment he nearly did. His knees buckled, his vision blurred, his soul felt stretched thin. Eternity was a weight too vast for any one heart. But he thought of the words Reeve had spoken in his dream. "A crown is only heavy if you keep wearing it." Aelion tore himself free with a cry, stumbling backward. "Then I cast the crown aside." He turned and fled before the voices could consume him. before the Emperor's hand could fall. Guards shouted, alarms blared, but Aelion was already running through the crystalline corridors, heart pounding with rebellion. The palace erupted in chaos. A prince had defied the Emperor. The heir had fled the oath. The Eternal Mind screamed treason across every corner of the orb. Soldiers poured into the docks, but Aelion had prepared. In the confusion, he slipped into a cargo bay, his disguise barely holding. He bribed a smuggler with the last of his jewels and climbed aboard a freighter bound for the outer ports. The ship rattled and stank of fuel, nothing like the smooth perfection of Velarion crafts. But to Aelion it was freedom. He pressed his forehead to the window, watching as the palace orb shrank into the distance, its perfect light fading behind him. For the first time, he was no longer within eternity's grasp. For the first time, he felt alive. The freighter jolted through the jump gates and Aelion clutched the pistol at his side, his only anchor. He knew the Empire would not forgive him. They would hunt him across stars, but he also knew where he was going. The Wayfarer. The name was whispered in every dock, every tavern, every tale of daring and defiance. And Elias Reeve was at its heart. Aelion would find him. He would stand before the Ash Captain again, not as a prince, but as a man who had chosen fire over eternity. And perhaps, Reeve would show him how to burn. The path was set. The crown was behind him. Ahead lay exile, rebellion, and the fragile, brutal beauty of a human life. The Ash Captain's terms. The smuggler's freighter wheezed like a dying animal as it limped through the dust fields of the Varos fringe. Panels rattled, fuel lines leaked, and every vibration reminded Aelion how far he had fallen from the flawless perfection of Velarion crafts. Yet he found himself cherishing each jolt. Every imperfection was proof he had escaped. He was free. For weeks they hopped from port to port, rusted stations orbiting dead rocks, slums built from scavenged hulls, colonies where the air smelled of smoke and desperation. Here the Empire's banners fluttered less boldly, and whispers of rebellion clung to every alley. And always, in the cantinas and docking bays, one name returned. Elias Reeve, the Ash Captain, the man who had cheated Imperials, outrun pirate clans, survived sieges where no mortal should. Some cursed him as reckless. Others hailed him as legend. But all spoke his name with fire in their voices. To Aelion it was a compass. Each whisper drew him closer. The trail ended at a station clinging to the wreckage of a shattered moon. It had no name, only a number. Outpost 72. Its corridors smelled of rust and sweat, its lights flickering with every power surge. But in its heart, docked at a hidden bay, Aelion found her, the ship that had haunted his dreams. The Wayfarer. She was scarred and battered, hull patched with mismatched plates, her silhouette jagged against the docking lights. Yet she pulsed with presence. She was alive, not in the sterile way Velarion crafts pretended, but with the scars of survival. And at her ramp stood Elias Reeve. The captain was older than Aelion remembered, or perhaps the years weighed differently in this light. His beard was streaked with silver, his coat worn thin, his stance relaxed yet unshakable. His eyes were the same, sharp, unyielding, alive with a fire Aelion had never known among his kind. "You," Reeve said, recognition flashing as Aelion stepped from the shadows. "The Prince of Glass." Aelion flinched at the words but lifted his chin. Not anymore. Reeve's gaze flicked over him. Servant's garb, soot-stained hands, the awkward way he carried the human pistol at his hip. A slow, humorless smile touched the captain's lips. "Runaway, then," he said. "I heard whispers, but I didn't believe them. A Velarion heir throwing away eternity? That's madness." "Or freedom," Aelion said, the word trembling but resolute. Reeve studied him in silence, the hum of the docking bay filling the air. Then he turned, motioning with his hand. "Come aboard, then. Let's see if you still want freedom once you've tasted it." The Wayfarer's interior was a maze of steel corridors, dimly lit, cluttered with wires, tools, and scars from battles past. It reeked of oil and sweat, alive with the hum of imperfect engines. To Aelion it was chaos. To Reeve's crew it was home. They were a ragged lot, scarred mercenaries, wiry mechanics, star-burnt pilots. They stared at Aelion with suspicion, muttering curses under their breath. To them, he was not one of them. He was a gilded prince, soft and dangerous. Reeve ignored their stares. He led Aelion to the mess hall, a chamber lined with dented tables and mismatched chairs. The crew gathered, waiting. Reeve leaned against a bulkhead, arms crossed, and spoke loud enough for all to hear. "This one wants to be human," he said, jerking a thumb at Aelion. "Wants to bleed and starve and burn like the rest of us." The crew erupted in laughter, bitter, mocking. One woman with a scar running down her cheek spat onto the floor. "Let him try," she sneered. "He won't last a day." Reeve silenced them with a raised hand. His gaze never left Aelion. "You want to join us?" he asked. "Then you earn it. No crowns here, no titles. You work, you fight, you bleed. And if you fail, no one carries you. You die." Aelion's chest tightened. The weight of the words pressed heavy. He thought of the oath he had fled, the eternity he had cast aside. He thought of the laughter in taverns, the cry of the child, the dream of fire. "I accept," he said softly. Reeve studied him, eyes narrowing. Then he nodded once. "So be it. But understand this. Life out here isn't just fire. It's ashes, too. Everything burns eventually. Even men like me." The days that followed were trial by ordeal. Reeve threw Aelion into labor, hauling crates heavier than he thought he could lift, cleaning engines thick with grime, patching hull plates under the hiss of leaking plasma. His body ached, hands blistered, muscles screamed with strain. Velarions were bred for grace, not grit, and the work tore at him. Yet Aelion refused to falter. Each bruise, each cut, each bead of sweat felt like victory. Pain was proof. Pain was life. The crew tested him mercilessly. They mocked his soft hands, tripped him in corridors, shoved him during drills. But Aelion bore it all, silent, stubborn. When he collapsed at night in his bunk, a rusted frame in a corner of the barracks, he smiled through exhaustion. He was no longer a prince. He was just a man trying to endure. But endurance was not enough. 1 week into his trial, the Wayfarer fell into an ambush near the asteroid fields of Zoran. Pirate ships swarmed them, guns blazing, engines roaring. The crew scrambled, alarms screaming through the ship. Reeve took the helm, voice steady as thunder. "Battle stations. Hold the line." Aelion was thrown into chaos. He was handed a rifle, its weight foreign in his hands. The crew surged past him, disciplined in their chaos, each knowing their role. Aelion hesitated, just a moment. But Reeve's voice cut through the storm. "Move, Prince." And Aelion moved. He took his place at the gun ports, firing blindly at streaks of light in the void. His shots went wide, his arms shook, but he kept firing. When the enemy breached the hull, he fought hand to hand, clumsy and desperate. His ribs cracked under a pirate's boot. His blood slicked the floor, but he rose again and again. By the time the pirates retreated, the Wayfarer was scarred. The crew bloodied, and Aelion lay gasping on the floor, body broken but alive. Reeve stood over him, gaze steady. "Now you've tasted it," he said. "The fire, the ash. Still want it?" Aelion coughed blood, his vision swimming, but his voice was steady. "Yes." For the first time, Reeve's expression softened, just barely. A flicker of respect. That night, as the crew celebrated survival with bruised laughter and cheap drink, Aelion sat among them. His ribs throbbed, his hands shook, but he laughed with them, raw and unguarded. For the first time, he was not watching humanity from behind glass. He was living it. He had chosen fire, and it had nearly killed him. But he would not turn back. Not now, not ever. Ashes of obedience. The stars burned like scattered embers across the black sea of space, but to Kalen they felt like witnesses, millions of cold eyes judging every breath he took. The rebellion he had kindled with a whisper, with a vow torn from envy and longing, had now spread like wildfire. The boy who had once been only a prince was becoming something else, a traitor to his throne, a renegade chasing freedom. And yet within him, the chains of upbringing clinked like ghosts. He could still hear his father's voice, stern and vast, echoing in his mind. Obedience is survival. Defiance is ruin. The alien fleet had moved quicker than Kalen expected. His secret departures with the human captain, his daring ventures onto rusted cargo decks and battered warships, had not gone unnoticed. Now, sleek black vessels marked with the sigil of his house prowled at the edge of every charted route, their purpose clear, to bring the wayward prince home, alive if possible, broken if necessary. It was on the desert moon of Tarrakesh that the noose first drew tight. The Asterion, Captain Rourke's ship, landed in a canyon scorched by centuries of wind. Sand, fine as ash, hissed against its hull, The crew moved in weary silence, unloading supplies, trading with the nomadic settlers who dwelled in bone-white tents. But unease lay thick in the air, a tension Aelion could almost taste. The horizon seemed too still, the stars above too sharp. Night fell quickly on Tarrakesh, the kind of night where darkness pressed down like a lid, swallowing everything. The first strike came with the sudden scream of ion fire. A blast tore through the sky, shattering a canyon wall and throwing plumes of molten rock into the camp. Chaos erupted, nomads screamed. Beasts scattered. The Asterian's crew scrambled for weapons, shields, cover. Aelion's heart raced, not with fear but with recognition. Those blasts sang in the timbre of his people's weaponry. The fleet had found him. He should have fled. He should have run into the shadows and begged the captain to abandon him. Instead, Aelion felt something bloom in his chest, a defiance that burned brighter than the cannons above. He refused to be dragged back to a palace cage. The battle that followed was unlike any Aelion had known. Not the clean, ceremonial skirmishes his kind engaged in, fought at a distance with elegance and restraint. This was raw survival. Humans fought with desperation, with fury, with love for one another. They covered each other with wild bravery, even when the odds bled against them. Aelion, for the first time, fought not as a prince but as a man who could bleed. He fired a plasma rifle until his hands blistered. He dragged a wounded engineer through sand and fire. He felt the sear of shrapnel rip across his shoulder and did not falter. For a fleeting moment, amid fire and smoke he belonged. But then came the voice. Across the battlefield, through the comm channels hijacked by force, his father's command seared into the air. Aelion, son of my blood, kneel. Lay down your arms and I will spare these fragile creatures you cling to. The prince froze. Around him the crew staggered, exhausted and bloodied. He could see Rourke, battered but unbroken, firing into the night with the grim steadiness of a man who had nothing to lose but his pride. And Aelion felt the weight of his birthright slam back into him like a crushing tide. His people's ships blotted out the stars. Their cannons could annihilate the canyon in a breath. He could end this slaughter by a single gesture, by surrendering himself, by obeying as he always had. But then his eyes fell on a mechanic barely older than a child, dragging herself to reload a weapon though her arm hung useless. He saw the nomads shielding their families with their bodies. He saw Rourke standing defiant as though the heavens themselves could not bend him, and something inside Aelion snapped. He raised his rifle, not toward the sky in surrender, but toward it in defiance. I am not your son, he whispered into the comm, his voice low but shaking with fire. Not anymore. His words were a knife. Silence followed, a silence heavier than any roar of battle. Then for the first time in his life, Aelion heard something break in his father's tone, a hint of disbelief, of grief wrapped in rage. The cannons thundered again, but this time Aelion felt no chains. He was ash now, ash burned free from obedience. By dawn, the canyon was a graveyard of ships and bodies. The Asterian was crippled, its hull scorched and bleeding smoke. The human crew had lost many. The nomads wept over their dead. Aelion stood amidst it all, armor cracked, his blood mingling with the sand. He had made his choice, but choices had costs. And as the sun rose over Tarrakesh, Aelion knew the war between prince and father, between kingdom and freedom, was only just beginning. The weight of mortality. The Asterian drifted through the dark, wounded. Its engines coughed smoke. Its shields flickered like torn sails. Tarrakesh had been a battlefield, but what lingered afterward was worse. Silence. Silence broken only by the groans of the ship's hull and the low cries of the injured. Aelion walked those corridors, his body heavy, his spirit heavier. He had bled with them, fought beside them, but now he saw the toll. 3 crew members wrapped in shrouds, their bodies already cooling in the void chamber where humans said their last goodbyes. He stood at the edge of that chamber, watching the ceremony unfold. No grand rituals, no orchestras of light, no proclamations written into history as with his own kind. Just words, soft and trembling, spoken by those who had loved the fallen. A mechanic pressed a charm of twisted metal into a friend's hands before the airlock cycled. A woman sang in a broken voice, the melody barely holding together. And then, with a hiss of pressure, the hatch opened and the bodies were given to space. The silence afterward was unbearable. Aelion's chest ached with something unfamiliar. Not duty, not pride. It was raw, piercing grief, and it was his own. He turned away, but Rourke found him in the corridor. The captain's face was bruised, his arm in a sling, yet his eyes still burned with the same steady fire. He looked at Aelion not as a prince, not as an alien curiosity, but as a man who had made a choice. "You fought like one of us," Rourke said quietly, "but that means you carry it too. Their deaths are yours now, same as mine." The words were not accusation, they were truth. And truth, Aelion realized, was heavier than any crown. For days he labored with the crew. His hands, once meant for ceremonial blades and jeweled goblets, now tightened bolts and carried scrap. He climbed into the blackened engine chambers, where heat seared the skin and smoke clawed at the lungs. He worked until his muscles screamed, and for the first time in his life, exhaustion felt clean. But with every sunrise on the ship's chronometer, news arrived. The royal fleet spreading wider, hunting harder, their fury sharpening. He had not merely defied his father, he had humiliated him. The house of Aelion's bloodline could not afford to be seen as weak, and so the hunters would come until every star turned hostile. It was in those nights, when sleep refused him, that Aelion began to truly envy humanity, not just their freedom, not just their fire, but their mortality. To his kind, life stretched long and endless, centuries upon centuries bound by tradition and duty. Death was rare, an event shrouded in ritual, often distant and dignified. But here among humans, death was close. It was cruel, sudden, sometimes meaningless, and yet it gave every moment a sharpness, a brilliance. They laughed louder because time was short. They fought harder because the end was always near. Aelion began to crave that weight, the fragility that made every heartbeat matter. One night, he stood in the observation deck, staring into the ocean of stars. His shoulder still throbbed from the wound at Tarrakesh, and he welcomed the pain. It was proof of his own impermanence. He wondered what it would be like to live knowing tomorrow might never come, to wake with no certainty, only hope, to die without crowns or titles, but with sweat and love etched into memory. Rourke joined him there, carrying 2 mugs of bitter human brew that steamed like smoke. He handed one over without a word. They stood together in silence for a long time. Finally, Aelion spoke. His voice was low, uncertain, but charged with a longing that shook him. "Tell me, Captain, how do you bear it, knowing every day could be your last?" Rourke took a long sip before answering. His gaze stayed fixed on the stars, his shoulders heavy but unbowed. "You don't bear it," he said. "You live it. That's the difference." The words struck Aelion deeper than any blade. He thought of the ceremony, of the way humans touched one another before death, of the songs and the tears, the grief raw and unhidden. He thought of how alive they were, precisely because they were breakable. And for the first time in his life, Aelion made a silent vow, not to his father, not to his kingdom, but to himself. He would not return to immortality bound in chains. He would not endure a life stretched across centuries if it meant never truly living. He would embrace humanity's fire even if it burned him to ash. If it meant dying like them, then so be it. The War of Crowns. The war did not begin with banners or declarations. It began with a shadow. From the edge of the Venar Rift, the Royal Armada emerged. Vast leviathans of metal, black and gleaming, their hulls etched with the sigils of Aelion's bloodline. They moved with a terrifying grace, like predators closing in on prey too weary to run. Each vessel carried thousands, each one sworn not just to the throne but to the pride of a dynasty that would not forgive betrayal. The Asterion was a crippled sparrow in comparison. Its patched engines groaned, its hull still charred from Tarrakesh, its crew outnumbered 100-fold. Yet it carried something the Armada could not, Aelion's defiance, a spark bright enough to set kingdoms aflame. The crew gathered in the war room, its table flickering with half-broken hollow maps. Exhaustion carved lines into their faces, but not surrender. Rourke stood at the head, his sling discarded, his injured arm now bound tight in makeshift steel to keep it steady. Aelion stood beside him, no longer an alien prince, but a man marked by battle. "They'll come for him," said one of the officers, nodding toward Aelion. "Not us, not the ship. Him. If we hand him over." Aelion cut her short. His voice was sharp, but beneath it trembled a thread of sorrow. "If you hand me over, they will still burn this ship. My father's pride demands nothing less." The silence that followed was heavy. Every face turned to Aelion, not with the worship his own kind once offered him, but with something rarer, trust forged in shared blood and loss. Rourke broke the silence, his voice steady as iron. Then we don't hand him over. We fight. Not because we can win, but because no crown, no throne, no fleet gets to decide who we are. Kaelin's chest tightened. Humanity's madness, their refusal to kneel even when broken, filled him with something like awe. It was what he envied most, their ability to turn despair into defiance. When the battle came, it was like the collision of gods. The armada descended, filling the void with fire. The Asterion danced among the storm, weaving through torrents of plasma, her patched engines screaming with every turn. Smaller frigates struck like wolves, their hulls peeling under the barrage but refusing to fall. Kaelin manned the gunnery decks, his hands blistering against controls never meant for him, his voice hoarse from calling orders to human ears that trusted him without hesitation. Each explosion lit the void like a dying sun. Wreckage spun through the rift, glowing embers drifting in silence after every violent burst. And then came him, the flagship, a vessel the size of a city, its crown-shaped spires gleaming with cruel brilliance. At its heart sat Kaelin's father, the king, lord of 1,000 systems, commander of 10,000 souls, and yet, in this moment, just a father with a wound carved deep by betrayal. His voice filled the comm channels, vast and terrible. Kaelin, son of my blood, kneel now and I will end this. Rise against me and I will scatter your ashes across the stars. Kaelin felt every word pierce his chest. This was no longer just a battle. It was the war of crowns, a war between the weight of inheritance and the fire of freedom. He closed his eyes, and for a heartbeat he saw himself as he had been, a boy in jeweled halls, draped in silks, his hands too soft to hold even a dagger. Then he saw himself as he was now, scarred, bleeding, hands blackened with smoke and gunpowder, standing shoulder to shoulder with mortals who had chosen him not for birth, but for the man he was becoming. He opened his eyes, and for the first time he spoke to his father not as a son, but as an equal. I will not kneel, not to you, not to any crown. The words were a blade cutting the last tether. The flagship opened fire, the void erupted, waves of destruction poured forth, the Asterion twisting through the inferno like a wounded hawk refusing to fall. One by one, Rourke's crew gave their lives to shield her, their ships burning, their voices falling silent. Yet each sacrifice lit Kaelin's spirit brighter. He fired until his arms shook, until his body felt like fire itself, until he could no longer tell where the prince ended and the human began. And still the flagship loomed, unbroken, its cannons endless. The war of crowns raged, not across empires but in the heart of one man, Kaelin, who chose freedom over obedience, mortality over eternity, humanity over the kingdom of stars. But choices carried a price, and as the Asterion systems bled out one by one, Kaelin knew the final cost was approaching. The legacy of refusal, the Asterion was a dying star. Its lights flickered, its hull torn open to the void in jagged wounds. Inside, smoke choked the corridors, alarms wailed in broken rhythms, and the air stank of blood and burning metal. The crew clung to their stations with the desperation of those who knew the end had already come. And yet, they fought still. Kaelin staggered through the command deck, his body raw with wounds, his vision blurred by blood. The gunnery controls burned beneath his hands, each blast searing through nerves already aflame. Across the chamber, Rourke stood tall, bracing himself against a console, his voice iron even as the ship crumbled. "Keep firing," the captain roared. "If this is the end, we make them earn it." Kaelin's heart surged. He had envied humanity, envied their fragility, their laughter, their courage against despair. Now he was inside it, part of it. This agony, this defiance, this refusal, it was his at last. On the view screen, the royal flagship loomed closer, blotting out the stars. Kaelin could almost see his father behind those walls of steel and light, a man who had shaped him, caged him, loved him in a way that meant ownership, not freedom. The comms flared. His father's voice rolled across the void, not thundering now but low and aching. "Kaelin, my son, enough, you've proved your point. Do not throw your life away, come home. Come home and I will forgive." For a moment Kaelin faltered. A lifetime of duty, of obedience, of longing for his father's approval, rose like a tide. The crown, the throne, the eternity waiting for him, all of it hung before him, heavy with promise. But then he looked around. At the faces of the crew, smoke-streaked, bloodied, still fighting with teeth bared. At Rourke, battered yet unbroken, a man who had risen from nothing and become more than any crown could ever make him. At his own hands, scarred, blistered proof that he had lived not as a prince but as a man among mortals. He felt the fragility of his body. He felt the weight of mortality pressing in, and in that weight he found freedom. Kaelin's reply was quiet, almost tender. "Father, I do not want forgiveness. I want to live. And if I must die, I will die as they do, free." The silence that followed was vast, stretching across the void like a shroud. And then, with a voice hollowed by grief, his father gave the order. The flagship's cannons ignited. The Asterion shuddered. Its decks tore open. Flames consumed the command bridge as the ship screamed in her death throes. Kaelin felt the force throw him from his station, pain lancing through his chest. He crawled to the viewport, his body failing, his breath ragged. The stars beyond blurred, but their light pierced him still. He pressed a bloodied hand to the glass and whispered, not to his father, not to any crown, but to the stars themselves, "I am free." The explosion came like the birth of a son. The Asterion was no more. But legacies do not die in fire. Whispers spread across the systems of a prince who had defied a king, who had chosen mortality over eternity, who had fought not for crowns or empires, but for the right to be free. His name was spoken in hushed tones among rebels, in taverns on forgotten moons, in the songs of those who had nothing but defiance left. And in time, even in the gilded halls of his father's palace, the tale of Kaelin was told, not as a tragedy, but as a seed of rebellion. For every kingdom is built on obedience, and every kingdom fears the day a son refuses to kneel. Kaelin had envied humanity. In the end, he became what he envied. Not eternal, not crowned, but alive and free.